Thank you very much, Professor Tay. And let me say I'm delighted and honored to be here, to have been asked to participate in an event with so many distinguished participants and such an impressive audience. And I want to thank, as others have, Randy and Liz for inviting me to take part. As its title suggests, the purpose of this conference, at least as I understand it, is to look forward and roughly 15 years into the future. And needless to say, this is impossible to do, certainly with any assurance. We simply don't have theories or models or crystal balls powerful enough to allow confident prognostication about anything as complex, as massive, as diverse, and as rapidly changing as China, to say nothing of Asia writ large. So the best I think we can do is to try to identify some of the factors that we believe or have reason to believe will be most important in shaping the course of events and to speculate about how they may interact with one another. And as regards the future of Asia, I would put at the top of my list the issues discussed by the previous panel. What happens in China to China, whether it continues to grow in wealth and power, and if so, at what pace, and whether it continues to be ruled by a one-party regime or evolves towards something different, perhaps something more democratic, will go a long way towards shaping the future of the region and indeed the rest of the world. A close second and a closely related factor, in my view, is the character of the relationship between the United States and China. If tensions between these two Pacific powers grow, all of Asia and perhaps other regions as well could be divided in something that might resemble a new Cold War. On the other hand, a deepening US-China entente would bring with it increased possibilities for sustained global economic growth, the peaceful resolution of outstanding regional disputes, and the successful management of pressing global problems. At present, I think it's fair to say that the Sino-American relationship is profoundly mixed. It contains important elements of both competition and cooperation. Contrary to what's often suggested, I think the competitive aspects of the relationship are, in fact, deeply rooted. They're not merely the result of misperceptions or misunderstandings or policy errors, although these do contribute on both sides. They are instead, I believe, the product of two fundamental features of the contemporary international system. First is the current rapidly changing distribution of power. Throughout history, relations between established powers and fast-growing potential challengers have always been fraught with tension, suspicion, and often open rivalry. Dominant powers are reluctant generally to surrender their privileges, while rising powers are drawn to challenge existing hierarchies of influence and prestige that were put in place when they were relatively weak. Now, none of this means that a Sino-American conflict is inevitable, but I think it does help to explain the presence of a strong impulse toward rivalry between the two countries. The second factor is ideology. In the case of the United States and China, the effects of this impulse due to the structure of power are amplified by the differences in the character of the two domestic political regimes. And just to, one can go on at length about this, but I think it's fair to say that the American people, the US government, are not inclined to fully trust a government that they see as secretive, repressive, and undemocratic. And in my view, they're right to do so. And China's current leaders suspect that the ultimate aim of American policy is to see them displaced from power, albeit by peaceful means. And in a sense, they're right too. It's hard enough for a rising and a dominant power to manage their relationship peacefully, and the ideological gap that separates the United States and China, at least now, makes the task far more difficult. If over the next 15 years, China continues to become wealthier and more powerful, but its regime remains essentially unchanged, in other words, if it continues along the trajectory that it's currently following, and it very well may not, the competitive aspects of the relationship, I think, are going to grow more prominent. And the cooperative elements, although they will remain, as a whole, will be a smaller part and perhaps a less significant part of the overall relationship. China, in addition to everything else, presents the United States with an unfamiliar intellectual challenge. For the better part of the 20th century, and certainly during its second half, Americans have had the luxury of dividing the world up, at least in their minds, into two camps. On the one hand, friends, mostly fellow democracies, who are our allies and also our major trading partners, and on the other hand, foes, mostly non-democracies with whom we talked little and traded less. Now, at this point, China is neither friend or foe, or rather, in certain respects, it's both. It is an emerging strategic rival with an authoritarian regime that happens also to be one of our most important commercial partners and diplomatic interlocutors. And this unfamiliar condition, I think, creates a kind of cognitive dissonance, which individuals tend to resolve by focusing on only one aspect of the picture or the other. And I would say, overall, our elites, our political and commercial elites in this country, have tended to focus on the cooperative elements of the relationship and to downplay or to ignore the competitive. Despite this difficulty, since the end of the Cold War, the US government as a whole has managed to develop a reasonably coherent strategy for dealing with China. And this didn't emerge from some rational, comprehensive process of analysis and planning. It is nowhere codified in a single document like NSC 68. Rather, it's evolved and grown organically over time. And this strategy consists of two elements. One, most obviously, engagement, economic, diplomatic, societal, at every level, attempts to engage with China, but also, at the same time, balancing or hedging, the previous administration used that term, what Chinese observers sometimes refer to as containment. Maintaining US forces, US bases, US alliances, and quasi-alliance relationships sufficient to ensure a favorable balance of power even as China's capabilities grow. And although policymakers certainly don't use these words to describe them, I think that the US strategy for dealing with China has essentially two goals. The first is, for lack of a better term, to tame it, to encourage it to adjust its objectives and its policies so that they coincide more closely with our own, making China a responsible stakeholder in the current international system. The second goal in the long run is to encourage China's political transformation, albeit by indirect means, to promote its eventual transition from one-party authoritarian rule to liberal democracy. And American presidents used to be more candid or perhaps less diplomatic in blurting this out, often in front of Chinese counterparts, and I think we're somewhat surprised to find that they didn't like to hear this. Obviously, it implied that they would be put out of a job. But I think that remains, at root, an important objective of US policy. The implicit US long-term vision for Asia, again, largely unarticulated. I don't want to claim that this is something cast in stone, but I think it's rather like the US vision for Europe after the Cold War. Asia whole and free, a region filled with democracies, tied together by trade and political institutions, fully integrated into an open international system, and with the United States retaining a significant presence and continuing to play a vital role. This mixed strategy that I've described has proven to be quite durable. It has survived several domestic political transitions in this country, from Bush 1 to Clinton to Bush 2, and now I think to Obama. I don't expect that there will be major shifts. And it's also proven resilient in the face of a number of crises and confrontations between China and the United States. Now, not surprisingly, China's current leaders, and that's all that I'm referring to here, appear to have a very different vision for Asia